I'm Jay Loff. I'm the publisher of The Atlantic, and I'm here to introduce the next in a series, our Life in America series. This is Work in America. Without the big three, what road are we on? We've got a distinguished panel of journalists here to discuss the topic, and to moderate, we turn to Gary Labovich, who's a vice president at Booz Allen Hamilton in a leadership role in the firm's civil government business. Since joining the firm in 2004, he's focused on providing strategy consulting and technology solutions in markets that range from the environment, energy, transportation, finance, and health. He holds a master's degree in public management and policy from Carnegie Mellon University. And without further ado, I turn it over to Gary to lead the panel.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Let me take a moment and first introduce each of our panelists, after which I'll then provide you with a short brief on the topic this morning. Following that, I will then pose a question to our panelists, and we'll get our discussions moving along. So to my right is Vijay Vaitheeswaran. He's an award-winning correspondent for The Economist, where he covers topics such as innovation, health, and biotechnology. He's an advisor to the World Economic Forum on clean energy innovation and serves as an expert advisor to investors and charities interested in promoting clean energy and micropower. Some of you might have heard his talk this morning on his recent book, Zoom, The Global Race to Fuel the Car of the Future, which was named Book of the Year by the Financial Times. To Vijay's right is Michael Kinsley. Michael is a columnist for the Washington Post. For many years, he was the editor of the New Republic and was the founding editor of Slate. He also served as the editor of Harper's, editorial and opinion editor of the Los Angeles Times, and the American editor of The Economist. He was a co-host of the CNN program Crossfire, and with William Buckley, he was a regular on PBS's Firing Line. He's also the editor of a book called Creative Capitalism, a conversation with Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and other economic leaders. And to Michael's right is Megan McArdle. She has worked for 3 startups, spent 4 years as a technology project manager for a boutique consulting firm, and as an executive copy girl for one of the disaster recovery firms at Ground Zero. For the past 4 years, she has worked in a variety of capacities for The Economist, where she wrote about economics and oversaw the founding of Free Exchange, which is the magazine's economics blog. She also maintains her own blog, Asymmetrical Information, which moved to The Atlantic Monthly in August 2007. So we have an esteemed panel of Economist alums with us. And let me start off.
They haven't fired me yet. I'm still there.
There you go. So let me start off with a question and ask each of our panelists to sort of give a perspective. Let me start with you, Vijay, and I'd like each of you to respond to this. In the 1980s, Lee Iacocca stated that as GM goes, so goes the nation. Some might find that a bit of a frightening statement today. What's your perspective on what that statement means for us today and tomorrow?
You could look at it in a couple of levels. And of course, it was always hyperbole. It wasn't quite true, but there was a sense in which the automobile industry was seen as the industry of industries, one that sat on top of and inspired and fed a variety of supplier industries, but also came to represent something else. It was the heart of American ingenuity. The product, the motor car, represented a lot of what was iconic about America. The open road, freedom, manifest destiny. I would even call it manifold destiny, really. And so in the public imagination, and especially in the public policy process, which the auto industry and its symbiotic twin, the oil industry, managed to capture, in my opinion, we began to equate what's good for Detroit and Houston with what's good for America. And I think that's where a lot of things began to go pear-shaped. That in fact, those two things were not necessarily the same thing. And as the world changed, as we saw new actors on the stage, rising Japanese car companies, the concerns that came from the problematic half of that marriage, that is the oil, which was responsible for the environmental damage, which was responsible for the geopolitical complications, the price volatility, the people associated with cars. We began to see a car industry in the rest of the world begin to see oil as a problem and develop cars of the future. But in America, we retained that mentality that we had of plentiful oil supplies, cheap and cheerful. Gas should always be $1 a gallon. I mean, sort of somewhere in the back of every American's head, we have imprinted, if it's over $1 a gallon, somebody is screwing us. And I don't know where we got this, but there's just a sense that we're entitled to that free, quote-unquote, free open road. And I think the world has changed, and there are a lot of external costs to burning gasoline in our cars. Detroit never adapted to that world. It fought it tooth and nail through its political lobbying, through the voluntary restraints on imports from the Japanese. We'll remember those from the Reagan era. We'll remember much more recently loopholes to the CAFE or fuel economy legislations. Every effort to encourage change, never mind market-based competition that moved ahead of Detroit, was fought. So I would argue that what had once been a pride and joy of American innovation really became a sad example of using innovation and lobbying in Washington rather than the ingenuity that was possible through their engineering talents.
Michael, before you go, if I might, I want to give a little brief on what this session is, so I sort of skipped that. So let me just quickly summarize sort of the key elements of our approach here. What we're really trying to examine today is the steady decline of the auto industry, and is it time for America to focus on a key innovation and competitive question, which is what's next? Which industry will spearhead American growth and prosperity into the 21st century? I think Vijay touched on a little bit of this, that Detroit and the American automobile industry has served as the symbolic industrial epicenter of America. And for 100 years, Detroit has served as one of the world's leading centers for the production of automobiles. Its factories and those of its enormous supply chain employed millions of workers, and importantly, offered blue-collar work as high-paying jobs that promoted the growth of the American middle class. However, beginning in the 1980s, this landscape changed dramatically as competition came to the American shores from Japan and Europe. And eventually, market share started to erode. In the past several months, the big three have all but collapsed. Chrysler and GM were forced into government bankruptcy, and with the U.S. government expected to own a majority share of the latter. Ford is still afloat, but most recently reported a net loss of $1.4 billion in the first quarter of 2009 alone. News of the U.S. auto industry's demise and the Detroit bailout has been a constant this year, and while the industry still contributes 2 to 3 million jobs to the U.S. economy, it's clear that the big three's influence has clearly waned. And while automobile manufacturing may be suffering, there is reason to believe other manufacturing platforms could serve as platforms for American innovation. Industries such as biotechnology, nanotechnology, and green technologies are growing industries where America could lead the way. So the question for this panel to examine is which industries will now emerge in the 21st century as the embodiment of U.S. competitiveness and leadership? What are the new growth engines in the American economy? And what we want to do is take a quick look back, but also focus more importantly on the future. What's next? Where should we make our bets? And what can we expect to happen in the next 20, 30, 40 years?
Well, I feel totally unqualified to answer any of those questions. I just have to ask Vijay a quick question. Am I the only person in the room who's unfamiliar with this term, go pear-shaped? What does that mean?
It all went downhill.
Oh, all right.
It's one of those Britishisms that
Yes.
Megan was mentioning.
It makes us sound sophisticated.
Oh, it did. I tried to think what I could contribute to this panel, and one thing I came up with is I grew up in Detroit during what we now see was the golden age of automobiles. And it was not just that the industry was dominant and that it affected the economy. I mean, the industry really affected everybody's life. And my dad didn't work for an auto company, but he was a doctor, but he had his practice on Wide Track Drive in Pontiac, and all his patients were from Pontiac, and when Pontiac was doing well, he did well, and when Pontiac wasn't, he didn't, and it was the dominant force in society. And I think Detroit was the place where a working man, and they were mostly men, could by himself earn enough money to raise a family, have maybe a cabin somewhere or a boat. And this might be someone who didn't go to college, maybe didn't even finish high school, an unskilled worker. And those days, it's obvious, are gone, I think. And, you know, I think that's unfortunate. And it's also a little puzzling to me. I mean, we're getting richer as a society, maybe not at the moment, but in general, the society keeps getting richer. And yet, these middle-class lifestyles for people who are not classically middle class have disappeared.
Megan?
I think that GM is the victim of several broad forces. First is that if you look over the last 2 centuries, one of the major drivers of economic growth is just transportation. First the railroads, and then automobiles, and then airplanes revolutionized the way that we can get goods from one place to another. And as a veteran of The Economist and a great proponent of free trade, we know that when we have more trade, we increase our own productivity, and that raises everyone's living standards. So everything from being able to ship corn across the Appalachians up to FedEx being able to get packages to you in a day has raised our ability to live, as a nation more richly. That's really ending. We're now transporting information much more than we are transporting goods, and so that's changing the profitability of these industries. The second trend that happened to GM is that they had a really lovely cartel going, and Chrysler and Ford. The auto industry has very high what's called minimum efficient scale, which is the minimum production load that you can carry at a factory or as an industry and make money. So auto plants have to operate at very high capacity, and if you've ever wondered why you can't order a car from your auto dealer the way you order a computer from Dell, there are 2 reasons. One is that auto dealers are very politically powerful, but the second is that auto companies have to operate at something like 85% of capacity just to break even. And so they need to produce a large run of cars and then have a dealer cut individual bargains with consumers in order to push those cars out of the door. So as long as there was no competition from foreign trade, because there are such high barriers to entry, you basically only had 3 players. You had some small companies here and there, but they ultimately got absorbed by the big 3. The big 3 were able to coordinate between the 3 companies, especially because they shared a union, which meant that they weren't competing on labor costs. And so that allowed them basically to operate a really cozy cartel. When they were hit by competition, they didn't know what to do. They'd grown up in basically a 50-year era in which what they didn't have to do was worry about cutting costs in order to meet their competition, because they had all of these elaborate signaling arrangements between the companies to make sure that no one started a disastrous price war. Well, the Japanese weren't playing that game. The Japanese were willing to come in with a higher quality and lower cost product and undercut them and gain market share. And they didn't have the UAW to facilitate these sharing agreements. And so when GM was hit with these competitive decisions, the big 3 repeatedly made bad decisions. And in part, it is fair to blame that on the UAW, as a lot of conservatives do, because they made decisions about things like, do I try to face down the UAW, or do I simply put lower quality parts into my car and shave costs that way? So they started making lower quality costs. They didn't take on work rule arrangements. But they also didn't innovate in engineering. They kept doing the same thing that they had done for 50, 60, 70 years because there was a market for it. They pushed into trucks because the Japanese and the Germans faced tariffs on trucks that American companies don't face, and it was their last really profitable area. And they kept betting the farm on narrower and narrower market slices that didn't face the kind of competition that they'd been getting from abroad, and Americans kept saying, no, I'd rather not, please. They're now in the position, of course, where gasoline prices, when they went up, undercut the last profitable business they had, which was in the large car and SUV market. And the company was just not in a position to innovate in small cars. They're not in a position to rethink their whole management structure, to shut down massive numbers of plants in order to save the core, which is why it took bankruptcy. It really did take bankruptcy to get these companies to shed costs, to shed marquees that weren't making money. But there's a third trend, and that has to do with the people who worked there. Because my grandfather, in the middle of the Great Depression, worked as a grocery boy until he was 26. Then he bought a gas station, and he made a great middle-class living for his family in a small town. He was like the king of a little small town he lived in. My cousin, his grandson, is also, like my grandfather, not academic. he's just not cut out for school. He doesn't like it. He basically got a GED rather than graduating for high school. Well, his alternative is to go into the service. There's no place for him now. It's hard, even union trades, which are often thought of as unskilled jobs, for a skilled, high-paying union job as a machine operator, you need to be really good at high school math. It's actually quite skilled and quite academic. So what does that mean for the workers going forward? We've upskilled our workforce, which is good, but it's leaving people who aren't necessarily cut out for an academic skilled career. Those wages aren't there anymore. Now, the tragedy of it is that those wages were made possible by this cartel. The wages, they cut side deals, and the economists would say they cut side deals with the union to buy political and labor peace. They paid above market wages because the UAW was politically powerful and because they didn't want strikes. Well, now that you have competition, those side deals aren't possible, and that's broadly true of the American manufacturing sector. There aren't these fat profits there, and meanwhile, it's getting easier and easier to automate away those semi-skilled jobs that were providing good middle-class living for people who didn't go to high school. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about what that means
Vijay
in the
and
future.
Michael, I think both you guys want to respond.
Okay. Sure. A couple of follow-on points. I think both my colleagues have identified the forces that got us here. Michael pointed out the tragedy of what's happening. It's been pointed out, the middle class squeeze, particularly a squeeze for those with unskilled work. The UAW was a bit of an anachronism that allowed a situation to continue that otherwise probably would not have. I would argue that, and we've seen this in the wage differentials, of course, between skilled workers and unskilled workers growing over time. I would argue that going forward, this is but a small taste of things to come. If we were to look globally, we're living through an extraordinary economic phenomena. The rise of China, but India behind it perhaps by 10, 20 years, South Africa, the other developing giants. In one generation, this is something, of course, to be heralded in many ways. 1 billion people rising out of poverty, and perhaps in the space of a lifetime, the biggest economic phenomena since the arrival of Europeans in the New World, I would argue. And its implications are going to be vast. But the disruption to our way of life in the US and the comfortable lives, particularly of those workers, for example, in Detroit, is that the workshop of the world is not going to be a high-wage country. Sorry to say. Broadly speaking, much of that, it's not tenable going forward. So the rewards will come to more skilled labor. It doesn't mean fancy PhDs, but certainly, even at the level of the bottom end of the labor market, people will need to have better training, useful skills. I think there is an argument for rethinking our approach to university education, emphasizing practical two-year degrees and providing government support, encouragement, and retraining and meaningful lifelong education vision for people, because we're going to have much more displacement, not less, I would argue. And honestly, going forward, when you think about innovation, what is innovation? I mean, I define innovation, the topic of our panel, as not just clever inventions or gadgets, but fresh thinking that creates value. And in a world where we are living in a world of globalization and Googleization, where ideas travel very quickly, where new business models are emerging from little corners in South African slums with mobile phones that have where you can pay for items, the Coke can that you want to buy. It's not just Japan where you can do it. You can do it, send money by mobile transfer in Kenya. I can't do that in New York City today. And so there are innovations happening around the world. The only sustainable basis for competitive advantage, I would argue, for a country like the United States, is going to be increasing use and leverage of the brain, not brawn. Already 80% of the economic value in OECD countries comes not from brawn-based industries, not the traditional manufacturing. It comes from areas where we use our mind, services, information, and all the other value-added, higher end of the value. And I think there's no way to compete against a China or one day a Cambodia or a Burma by thinking that we will be a manufacturing superpower in the old sense. So I think that, while I lament the change, I think we must do the policies that will help today's and tomorrow's workforce adjust and adapt. I don't think we can stand at the shore and decry the tides, because it ain't going to change.
Michael?
Well, I just want to ask both my colleagues. We all worked for The Economist, and we've all drunk the Kool-Aid about free trade and being open to technological change and creative destruction and all that. And yet, and we all believe that this is good for the world. It's good for each individual country in the world. It's good for most individual people in every country in the world. And yet, it seems pretty awful. It seems extremely scary. We've said it's destroyed a whole swath of the middle class. So my question is, are we sure that this is a good thing? And how are we going to persuade people that it is? And if we don't persuade people that it is, what are the political implications?
I really have to say, though, that there is in the American consciousness this mythical vision of a 1955 America in which everyone was having this incredible job at GM where they got paid in gold coins merely for showing up. And then they went home to these beautiful houses with their 2.6 children and so forth. My grandfather was a small business owner. His life was not secure. He worried all the time. In 1955, the New York Thruway was built, and his gas station, which had formerly been on the major highway running through upstate New York, suddenly wasn't. And he had to, rethink his whole business model, change what he did. And then in 1970, there was for a lot of people, that was not true. This was always true for a very small segment of the American workforce. This was not the experience of most people. And in fact, most people were buying overpriced, horrible cars from GM in the 70s. My parents drove a 1973 Chrysler Cordoba when I was in high school. I was like the only kid in America who did not want to borrow the family car. And it was a terrible car. Compare it to a 1973 Japanese car, and the Japanese car was better even though it was cheaper. The luxury cars were better, but the cars that the ordinary Americans who had small businesses or were going to jobs as secretaries or otherwise doing the majority of boring service and manufacturing jobs that didn't have luxuriously paid unions because their industries didn't have those kinds of margins, those people were suffering at the hands of GM and Chrysler and Ford and the UAW. They were paying those people higher wages in order to themselves. It was a transfer from people who were worse off, by and large, to people who were better off. And I think that's something you really have to think about. Even within the country, it was a transfer from people who were worse off to people who were better off. So.
Another quick rejoinder. I know you want to move on, but if only we had a really the utopian free markets model with Schumpeterian creative destruction, I think that people would have been better off. But when you actually look at the practicalities, what you found was, in many ways, through policy distortions, through corporate decisions, through the union negotiations, you found labor market mobility, for example, dramatically restricted. An example is the health plans. Right now, America is in the midst of national hand-wringing over what comes next on healthcare. And having looked very closely at this, I just had the chance to write the Economist's current cover on healthcare. And it's extraordinary when you look at the numbers. But one of the things that's apparent is because of a particular deal that the Detroit companies made to prevent socialized medicine in America after World War II, we have this style of distorting employer-funded health insurance, employer-provided health insurance, which gets a massive tax subsidy from the government. And that, in effect, weds employees to their companies who might otherwise go elsewhere, who might start their own jobs, for example. So if you were having an industry that was in trouble, people might be much more ready to go and either work for a smaller company or take a chance, but not if that gold-plated health plan you have keeps you locked to a declining industry. So there are rigidities, and you can't blame free trade for that at all, Michael.
So basically, if they'd only listened to the Economist,
absolutely,
none of the...
You can say that at everything.
Yes, that's the general accent.
It's a commercial for the Economist.
I should also say the Atlantic is extraordinarily and a great deal at only $19.99 for 10 issues.
All right. Well, let me stop the sales.
The self-promotion. Yes.
Let me come back to if we take Michael's assumption that we could be on a path to the haves and the have-nots if things keep breaking down the way they are, and jumping back to Vijay's point, imagine you were part of the Obama economic team and you were asked to recommend some government policies to work on our competitive presence in the world today. What would be the kinds of things you'd be advocating to help retrain folks who've lost their jobs, but also importantly to start promoting the kind of competitiveness and the kinds of innovation that we need to regain, some would argue, our place in the world. What would be some of the things? Would you look at greater investment in R&D? Would it be lowering healthcare costs? Would it be changes in tax policy? What would be some of the ideas that you would start promoting to start generating this kind of innovation so that we can avoid what could be, as Michael suggests, a pretty scary scenario 5, 10 years out where we do have haves versus have-nots?
Everyone seems to be looking at me, so I suppose I'll start. The first thing I would do is a little weird. I would eliminate the corporate income tax, and then I would tax capital gains as ordinary income, because I think that a phenomenal amount of business activity is structured towards avoiding taxes and shifting jurisdictions and so forth. And I think this is just a bizarre source of inefficiency in our economy, because it's so much easier to tax income as it comes to people than it is to tax income from a corporation, which has so many more resources to change the definition of an income and an expense and so forth. I think it's a phenomenally wasteful tax, and I think that it actually has introduced a lot of weird structural rigidities into our economy. I think that one of the things is the fact there's a problem does not necessarily imply a solution. So I'm always skeptical of the fact that we immediately, well, what government thing could we do? It may not be that there's no government thing that we could do. The first thing I would be doing right now is actually just offering relocation assistance for people who live in Detroit, because the city is clearly, that whole region is clearly going to be devastated by this. And you've got a lot of people who are now underwater on their homes, and don't have the resources to just go elsewhere and look for work. And even despite our healthcare market, which I agree with Vijay has this weird distortion in it, in fact, American labor mobility is extremely high by European standards, and that's been one of the great strengths of our economy. We shift workers from where they're not needed to where they are. But places like Detroit right now, with the housing market, and frankly with this sort of faint hope that maybe it'll all pick up, people are trapped there, and that's impairing their lives, and it's impairing the efforts of the economy to recover. The next thing I think is obvious is you have to rebuild credit markets. As long as the American consumer balance sheet needs to be brought back into balance, which is going to take years. It's going to be hard to get the kind of economic growth we had before. Banks don't want to lend; they're repairing their balance sheets, which means it's harder for customers to get capital. And in fact, I know there've got to be a few entrepreneurs in this room, and so if you've ever worked with VCs, or you know that a lot of startup businesses are financed for the first few years on Visa and MasterCharge. So as those credit lines decline, it is going to be harder for people to go out and take risks. The last thing I would say in line with those risks is that we should be rethinking the 2005 bankruptcy reform, which made it a lot harder to declare bankruptcy. There were some good aspects of that reform, but overall, one of the surprising pieces of evidence from the United States is that the easier it is to declare bankruptcy, the more entrepreneurship and innovation you have in a state. States with higher homestead exemptions, where you can exempt more of the equity of your home, where you can shield more of the equity of your home from creditors, actually have higher rates of entrepreneurship. And it's not hard to see why. Early entrepreneurs often have to rely on their personal credit in order to get credit for their business. If the risk of failure is losing your home and leaving your family on the street, you're much less likely to strike out and try to found your own business. The area that I wouldn't look, and one that you commonly hear, is retraining. Not because I'm against it in theory. It seems like a good thing to spend government money on if we could make it work. But in fact, the experience with those programs has been more than dismal. They generally turn out to be a phenomenal waste of time for the people who are in them. We would be better off just giving people much more generous unemployment benefits and allowing them to figure out what the next step is for them.
Michael?
Oh, that was a pretty impressive list. I think if the two things that would be high on my list have already been mentioned. I mean, the two broad categories are obviously healthcare and education. And within those categories, I think a new emphasis on two-year colleges is very important. And within healthcare, I think getting the cost of healthcare off the backs of companies is crucial.
A quick point to follow up. I think I share Megan's skepticism that government can solve all problems, or indeed even this problem. But of course, there are things that it's important. The things Michael emphasized are things that government can do. But I'd be very skeptical of leaders promising to create new innovation clusters. When Singapore or the French government have tried, and everywhere in the world people have tried to create the next Silicon Valley. Everywhere in the world has failed. It is a fool's errand. Governments don't create innovation. You can do the preconditions, the framework conditions, lay the seeds, but innovation fundamentally is a bottom-up activity. And so I think that it's important not to confuse the two things. And if just to look at the example of the car industry, we started by talking about the death of Detroit in a sense. But let's remember there are two car industries in America. And the one we've talked about in Malaise, but there's a second car industry, mostly in the South, mostly non-unionized, mostly run by names like Nissan or Toyota, which is doing very well, thank you. And so that cuts to the heart of corporate culture and how we might even see, and in future, that might extend to Silicon Valley. The future of the car industry particularly really lies not with the grease and grime, the soot and sulfur, the guts of a mechanical engine, the stuff that I learned as a mechanical engineer at MIT is completely obsolete. It's really the electronics, the software, the hardware, the brains of the car of the future. And the Prius is a small taste of what's going to come. Those are all skills that Singapore and Silicon Valley do better than Michigan has traditionally. And it might very well be that we'll see a new cluster of automotive excellence in America emerging, new companies that connect the intellectual capital, including engineers from Detroit, but with different financial capital and different business models in more interesting ways. So I think that's not something that government can preordain.
So let me make an assumption like a good economist, and let's just assume away government for a moment, and let's look at venture capital. If you were a major venture capital firm today, sitting on a stockpile of dollars, where would you make your bets?
Newspapers.
I'm actually going to say something
Pennies on the dollar.
which is going to sound funny, but I'm totally serious. Robots. If you look at, I've just did a piece for The Atlantic on this. If you actually look at what succeeded during the Great Depression, I know this is a really sad idea that we might be going through this for another 3 or 4 years, but I think there's a risk that we're at least going to end up in a sort of Japan-like stagnation. And if you look at what people spend their money on when there are financial crises, what you actually see is that they invest in their homes. The one place where they keep spending money, so if you look at major appliances, for example, that we think of as commonplace now, things like radio, refrigerators, toasters, gas ovens, these were all things that actually achieved their major market penetration during the Great Depression. So national income has fallen by 1/3, manufacturing output's down 50%. People are still buying refrigerators and radios. And the reason is that when there's economists distinguish between market labor and home labor. And we're willing to, when we are in financial trouble, the first thing we do is we try to do more stuff at home and do less market production and purchase less market production. But the corollary of that is that we're actually willing to invest in our home, in making it a nicer place. You buy a flat panel TV because then I won't go out so much. It's sure it's a little expensive, but it's actually a lot cheaper than going to a bar 3 nights a week. And so I think that one area that we've been waiting for, at least if you're like me and you were a little girl and read your father's old science fiction novels, I've been waiting for my home robots for a long time. But we're actually getting to the point where this is getting more feasible. We have better AI. We have more. Some of you may have Roombas. I think that's the tip of the iceberg, and especially with more women working, there's always going to be a market for things that will replace the tedium of housework and make our home time more fun.
Besides newspapers, what else would you invest in?
Well, how much money do I have?
You have unlimited, infinite dollars.
I think I would, even if I were a venture capitalist, keep it in cash because I think.
Okay.
Your risk premium is basically infinite, is what you're saying.
Or I would put it in tips, actually, because I think the only way we're going to get out of the debt that we're building up is inflation.
I would say that one broad bet that if you're willing to, to buy and hold a portfolio, will be clean energy. Here's why. There will be many losers along the way, of course, as there always are in new industries. But if you look across, to contrast two tales, look at healthcare. I think, in fact, across rich countries, not just in the US, the move is on to curtail costs. Why? Because they've tended to go out of control. So you're going to see a much closer scrutiny of what has been called innovation, devices, gadgets, new pills, et cetera. So there's going to be a focus on cost pressure, rewards to innovators, and pretend innovators, bringing out Me Too drugs and so on, may diminish. So that the barrier is going to be much higher to get rewards in the healthcare space going forward, I would argue, and the risks to biotech companies and so on higher. Whereas if you look at clean technologies, low carbon particularly, but the broad gamut that falls under that umbrella, we're about to cross a line here, especially in the US, the biggest energy market in the world, the one that sets the global trends in many ways, where we're going from an era all through time where we had no carbon pricing. Right now, the price to emit greenhouse gases is zero, in effect. There's no federal policy. But that will change soon. And it doesn't matter whether it's this Waxman bill, which is a bad bill, by the way, but 8 years of doing nothing, its supporters tell me, we'll take anything we can. It doesn't matter if it's this incarnation or another. If you look at the broad trend, we're really crossing a bright white line in which we're going to start rewarding clean energies. Americans will start paying an honest price for energy. That is, dirty energy will have to pay for the impact on human health, for the impact on climate change, for the geopolitical complications, for example, that oil produces. Things we pay for. We pay for it through our lungs and our children's health. We pay for them through our tax dollars funding Pentagon misadventures. But we don't pay for it at the pump. And so we have the illusion of cheap energy. And as I think we're going to transform in fits and starts and in messy ways to paying more honest prices for energy. This doesn't mean less energy, and it can even mean the same price or lower priced energy. In the long term, it will be cleaner energy that will be rewarded if we get the policies right in this area, and the innovations will follow. So I would say that's a good long-term bet.
Let me ask one more question around innovation, and then we'll open it up to all of you. I think in this country we've seen over the last 50 or so years that there's been a tendency towards geographically driven centers emerge around new technologies and new innovations, around high technology in places like Silicon Valley and Route 128 in Boston, semiconductors in Austin, Texas, financial services industry in New York and Charlotte, North Carolina, biotechnology in Washington. These centers seem to emerge, they explode, they peak, and then they naturally lose some of their steam and they kind of sort of fade out. I guess the question I have for the panel is, do we see continuing value in these types of centers going forward? Or, given the advances we have today in technology, the evolution of virtual networks, will we see an increasingly virtual, more distributed model to impact innovation as we go forward?
Oh, well, my experience is only in the industry of journalism. And I started a web magazine called Slate, and it was, as you say, distributed. We had no central headquarters, and it worked. But I think the question comes down to, is virtual communication enough? Or is there something that even with all the wonders of today can't be duplicated in human exchanges? And I mean, in general, I reject that kind of thinking, that I love my newspaper because I can rattle it in the morning, or any of those arguments. But I do think, as someone who is trying to make a living writing about politics, that from Seattle, that output is easy, but input is hard. And I think no matter how good we get at virtual communication, that will always be true. And so a journalist will always want to be where the news is going on.
I'm also skeptical. I came out of the blog world, so there's no one, I am second to none in my appreciation for the ability to work virtually. I frequently work from home. But I think there are three problems with a distributed model. And the first is something akin to what Michael said. I cover economic policy. I could conceivably cover that from somewhere else, but then I won't go to the panels, I won't meet the congressman, I won't have casual conversations. So this is one part of it is simply what companies are finding is that the effect of running into people, they call it like the water cooler effect. The effect of running into people and having casual conversations turns out to be incredibly important, especially to innovation. Because when people run in together, if you have someone who's a chemist and then a guy from marketing who just happen to run in together, they have a casual conversation and that may reveal some key piece of information that moves your company forward in a very unexpected direction. The second problem is that people are very uncomfortable with virtual meetings. They don't happen the same way that normal meetings do. For one thing, anyone who's ever been on a conference call, checking your email, zoning out, with the TV on, you act differently when you are even when you're video conferencing than you do when you are actually face-to-face with someone. And people don't find, part of any successful business is making emotional and social connections with people. And you don't make them over video camera. Research seems to show that people just don't feel that same kind of bonding that they do when they have an actual face-to-face interaction. And that actually gets into the third thing, which is social networks, social and career networks. Any journalist who's in Washington, as in most industries, at senior levels, journalists do not get jobs because they sent in a resume and HR looked over it and came in and gave you a typing test. You get jobs because someone knows you, they know your work. When you're out of work or when someone else is looking for a new person, they pass you on to the next level. Building those social networks is not a matter of, you don't do that over IM. You do it by meeting someone at a cocktail party, by going to a picnic, by being at a conference, or running into them at a panel. Those are the ways that you cement those relationships that do two things. First of all, they make you, and I'm a better journalist because most of my friends are journalists. Not all of my friends. I think I would be a worse journalist if all of my friends were journalists. But I learn a lot about the craft by talking to other journalists. I learned a lot about the industry by talking to other journalists. But it's also building those career networks that are going to help me. Of course, I would never leave the Atlantic. But if I were going to, that would help me get to the next job.
Well, for the sake of, I actually think my colleagues to the right have said things that I agree with. But for the sake of a debate, let me present the counter-argument. Everything they have said was true 30 years ago. It's just a little bit less true now. And they're pushing against what is now very fashionable to argue about, which is the idea of open innovation, networks. And I think there is something to this idea. It has been oversold and overhyped, to be sure. But there is something new under the sun. It's not as though nothing has changed. And what's new is that, particularly, again, the twin forces of both people moving as well as ideas moving much faster and at much lower cost than they used to, does make it easier to collaborate from distant places. And there are more places that are centers of excellence outside the traditional ivory tower. For example, the R&D center at Xerox PARC, which invented many bits of the internet, or at least so it is claimed, or the graybeards at the AT&T labs who came up with many great inventions. That's not how a lot of the things that become valuable to society happen anymore. You often find people in cities names you wouldn't recognize coming up with ideas. There are examples of web-based outfits like Innocentive, where companies can put up a problem and let's say a particular chemical problem that a manufacturing company is having, they put it out there as a post, and bidders from around the world, often in obscure places in India or South America, will collaborate amongst networks to come up with amazing solutions at the best price. And so you are seeing this happening, and you're seeing large corporations, whether it be Procter & Gamble or others, really opening up their process, in part because the market has become much more nimble, much faster. The pace, even for something as mundane as consumer products, toothpaste, etc. The head of R&D at P&G tells me that the product cycle for his products has been cut in half over the last decade. That is, his competitors, often smaller competitors in developing countries, who can cut through the bureaucracy and the classic two-page P&G memo that you have to do before you make any change in the product. Well, those days are gone. You can't work like that. So the metabolism of business particularly has had to increase, And open collaborative networks are a part of that. It is a real trend. But again, I defer to my colleague's point that you can take the argument too far. You're not going to have virtual companies, because at the end of the world, I think Richard Florida has argued this, the world is not flat. It's spiky, or as I like to say, it's lumpy. And there is much value to the lumps that my friends argue for.
I wish you wouldn't call me lumpy, Vijay.
All right, well, on that note, let me come back to the premise here and open up the discussion to you all. Again, the premise here was without the big three, what road are we on? Where are we heading next? And I guess our esteemed panel here is predicting that it'll be either robots, newspapers, or clean energy, which will be the industries of the future. I guess we'd now like to hear from you and get your perspective. So please line up. We have mics here. If you could just get in line, sir.
Yes, wonderful panel, great topic. The stimulus package, which arguably is $700 billion to $1 trillion, wherever it is, critics have said that only a small fraction of it is being spent to create jobs. But my question is, are we wise in putting 50, 60, 70, $80 billion into the auto industry? And I wonder what you think about that. Will we ever see it as taxpayers? Will we ever see it or a fraction of it repaid? Or is this just going through the motions to make sure that all the UAW workers and management people get to their graceful days of retirement?
I think it was a bad idea. The reason that the government had to put money in was that no private investor was insane enough to do it, and there's a reason for that. So yeah, I think it was as an investment, it was a bad idea. Politically, how much choice did the administration have? I think it would have been very hard. I think it's arguable that Bush handed Obama a poisoned chalice. By the time that he got into office, how was he going to tell the UAW, which is one of his major supporters, yeah, no, bye. So I just don't think that, but as a matter of economic policy, there is no industry. Finance, arguably, you really have a situation where you have bank runs, you have panics or whatever. If GM had gone down, my Mini still would have worked. It would have started in the morning, I could have driven to work. There was no economic argument for saving that industry other than the political argument that the UAW wished to continue to have many auto jobs. I think there are better ways to help people who are in trouble. And I think that we could have given every auto worker $200,000 to start their own war on poverty. And it would have cost us less money than this deal did. So it's hard for me to say it was a good idea on any metric.
Absolutely right. I think that Megan's absolutely right. It had to be done politically. And I chaired a panel yesterday on the future of the automotive industry with two great experts. Unlike me, I'm a poser, but these were folks who've lived their entire lives thinking about this, and they were both convinced it was the right thing to do. But one of them confessed, I'm from Michigan, we're a company town. We would have had nothing if it hadn't been for this bailout. But I question that, and I think Megan's prescription is correct. If there was a case there is a clear public good in helping people who would have been displaced. But to keep a dead man walking, literally GM, with the same corporate culture problems that it's had, going with more and more taxpayer money, it was the wrong way to do this assistance. I would have much rather have seen the money given to directly for Tier 1, Tier 2 suppliers, credit lines. I understand the credit markets were frozen. One had to think of innovative solutions, but rather to see the intellectual and financial and industrial capacity reconnected by companies that know how to make a profit and have a good business model. And we've seen a small glimmer of this. GE just announced a few days ago, Jeff Immelt made a major announcement. They're going to set up one of their very, very few global R&D hubs in Michigan to take advantage of all the displaced workers who are sure to come. And there are a lot of talented people in Michigan, and GE is smart enough to figure out that it can capitalize on this and put them to the industries that it wants, including clean energy, energy storage, et cetera, that it has big visions for. I think that's really the way forward, not the kind of bailout we did.
I don't have anything useful to contribute except for a question about this GE thing. Did PR play any role
Absolutely.
by any chance?
Sure, and by all means, I'll dollop on the PR. I plug them here. I don't have a problem with that. But this is exactly the right role for PR. It's not greenwash. I mean, BP claiming it's beyond petroleum, let's take it with a grain of salt. It's an oil company, and it really will be an oil company for the next 25 years, for all intents and purposes. But a major industrial giant that is successful with viable industries, including $5 billion a year in sales in wind, which is GE Energy, investing in a depressed part of the U.S. to capitalize on exactly the kind of Schumpeterian destruction that we've talked about, reconnecting assets, that is people with skills, with their financial and business acumen. Hey, if that's PR, I'm happy to give it extra attention.
One other thing to note is that there's vast global overcapacity in the auto industry, and what the government did was preserve that overcapacity, which means that Ford is now going to have a harder time competing and may end up in bankruptcy as well, because of course it hasn't shed its supplier agreements or any of its debt. So this was really on many fronts, just I think economically a bad move.
Right. Jim Woolsey.
Thanks, Gary. Jim Woolsey, Vantage Point and Hoover Institution. I want to highlight quickly Megan's excellent insight about bankruptcy and entrepreneurship. There was an article some years ago in the Wall Street Journal in which someone was analyzing why in Germany there wasn't much innovation being stimulated. And he wrote that in Germany, if you've ever gone bankrupt, you'll never get your phone call returned from anybody with money. In Silicon Valley, he said, we wear our bankruptcies the way Prussian officers used to wear their dueling scars in the mess. And that's the difference. It's that culture. And I think it plays on what Vijay was saying about the importance of clean tech. In answer to Gary's question, within the clean tech area, I would look particularly for technologies and companies, and this is kind of what I do now, in which materials science is extremely important. LEDs are coming down fast in cost because people are innovating with materials. You're looking not a Moore's Law curve, but a part of a Moore's Law curve. Batteries are improving rapidly because of materials science, and that's directly relevant to the electrification of transportation, which Vijay especially has talked about. And solar of all sorts, photovoltaic, thin film, multi-junction. A lot of that is materials science. So you have an opportunity for cascading change, and a lot more rapid change than you do with other types of innovation. It's the same type of change, a bit slower, but we don't have nearly as far to go as we did with Moore's Law to produce cell phones at the pace that we had.
If I could just return for a second to the bankruptcy issue. I mean, you're not showing much sympathy for the people who are going to get stuck when you make bankruptcy easier. You're sort of financing your new economy on a sort of lottery of creditors, aren't you?
Well, if you'd read the excellent article in The Atlantic that I wrote on this from 1999 for 10 issues. The fact is that bankruptcy is the recognition of a fact, which is that someone doesn't have enough money to pay the creditors. Once you've recognized that fact, the question is, how do you allocate that money? Do you, for example, seize their house and sell it? There is an argument for doing that, but the downside of that is people are unwilling to take risks, and people are, have then they're sort of behind the starting line when they're trying to get a fresh start. The creditors go into it. I'm okay with the rules as long as the rules, everyone knows what the deal is when they start going in. Creditors charge interest rates based on the fact that they can't seize your house and sell it. Creditors know what the game plan is. Arguably, one of the big problems with the 2005 reform was that it changed the terms on consumers without grandfathering in old debt. But I don't think that there's anything wrong with stiffing creditors as long as the creditors understand the terms upon which they're extending credit. I think when you have the evidence shows in the United States that when you have easier bankruptcy, when you have more respect for failure as something that happens to people rather than as something that is inherently the result of evil or stupidity, then you have a much more dynamic economy because, there's a Thomas Edison line that I love. Someone asked him as he was struggling with the electric light bulb, Mr. Edison, how does it feel to have failed? And he said, what do you mean failed? I've discovered 10,000 things that do not make a good filament for an electric light bulb. And you laugh, but that's how you find out. What's a good filament for electric light bulb? Well, those things aren't.
Let me pick up on that point and connect it to Jim Woolsey's anecdote about the Germans. The failure is essential to the process of innovation. Absolutely essential. The companies that innovate best are ones that actually revel in and cherish failure, learn from failure. If you look at W.L. Gore, the company that makes Gore-Tex fabrics, famously, when a project is killed, they throw a party. right? And it's this little cheesy little thing, but the point is, let's celebrate it. We're not going to punish the person who ran the project. We pulled the plug in time so that we didn't waste vast swaths of resources. And that's a cultural shift. When you give the example of Germany and several European countries, if you are an entrepreneur and your company fails, you're banned from serving on the board of other companies for 10 years, for example. And never mind the fact that Auntie Broomhilda won't invite you to dinner parties. That's a very powerful cultural reason, because in Germany, as in France and other places, if your son is working for Siemens or Électricité de France, that's a respectable job. Whereas if you start up a company and it's still considered culturally questionable. And this is why, going back to our theme for this broad panel, I remain optimistic, despite the death of Detroit, because what America does best, and this is the broad shoulders on which our economy has risen over the last 200 years, is that wonderful learning from failure, pulling ourselves up, and the reason it happens, not only the frontier spirit and culture that we inculcate through all our brainwashing as Americans, but in fact, some boring, banal things like the bankruptcy code, like the way that debtor in position financing works. We have specific things, rule of law, and an expectation that we are going to be regenerating growth. We have a continental economy with very good labor market mobility, despite the health plan problems I pointed out. We have the capacity to renew ourselves, much more so than European economies or the Japanese economy, for example. So I'm very confident, as long as we don't do stupid things that repress that innate forward-leaning growth approach that the U.S. has from the bottom up, that we will come out of this with new centers of innovation and new industries.
Sir?
Yes, my name is Larry Sherman. I'm a longtime resident. In fact, my entire life is in Detroit. What you said about Detroit has been true. And I congratulate you for at least knowing what you're talking about through 1980s. Everything that the companies didn't do is exactly right. And we asked them to change, but we got nowhere. My question is very simple. In 10 years, will Chrysler, GM, or Ford still be in business?
Depends on whether there's a Democrat or a Republican in office. I think that it's not clear to me that, I don't think Chrysler is going to survive, and it's not clear to me that GM can survive without ongoing massive government subsidies. But Vijay, who knows more about this, may have a different
I would say
answer.
it's certainly not in any shape that we would recognize them. And I think,
we hardly recognize them now.
as it is, I mean, let's remember GM's decline for 30 years plus has been a steady downward decline. This is not something new because of the oil price spikes or any recent problem. I mean, it has been a dramatic, for a 100-year-old company, it has been on the decline almost in a straight line. And so the future is clear, and it hasn't adjusted. And normally when you're in a declining industry, for example, steel went through wrenching changes, and it found in, for example, Lakshmi Mittal, the British Indian, now multi-billionaire, who created Mittal Steel and Arcelor, a global consolidator. You found patterns of removing excess capacity. Those changes have yet to come to the automobile industry, mainly because of political patronage, because countries have tended to think of this as something that's a national industry, somehow relevant to the national security. The best thing we could do for the auto industry is to stop thinking of it as so essential to America that it must be defended at all costs. If you turn it around and say the innovation that it used to represent is what's essential, and let the chips fall where they may, we would actually be doing ourselves the greatest favor.
No one in America makes television sets anymore, and I don't feel like because Zenith is no longer manufacturing gigantic wooden things that my life is. But at the time, this was a big thing when the last American television company went down.
But, we still have wars in this world, and the wars need goods that Detroit can produce. They're not going to go away. We're not going to only have rockets and robots fighting wars.
I think that there's a strategic argument for this, but if you look at what actually happened in World War II, we ramped up capacity so fast, and we were making things we'd never made before. Do I think that I'm skeptical that we're necessarily going to have another totalizing war of that sort, because I think nuclear really is a game changer on that. But even if we did, do I think that America within a year could be rolling out Liberty ships or the modern equivalent again, even if Detroit wasn't there? as Vijay pointed out, we still have a domestic auto industry. Those plants would still be there. The workers would still be there. Even if we went to war with Japan, the workers at Toyota in Alabama are not going to go fight for the modern day Hirohito. They're going to fight for America and make goods for America. I have faith in our country.
Sir?
Thank you. Chip Cummins from Aspen, Colorado, and I produce something called American Renewable Energy Day. My question to the panel is in regard to the recent passing of the clean tech bill that Congress has endorsed, and how you see that by putting a price on carbon, if the Senate decides to ratify and if we go to Copenhagen at the end of the year with demonstrating real leadership of the willingness of the United States to now seriously address the issue of putting a price on carbon, do you see that as an innovation for the automotive industry and the rest of the economy? Especially, perhaps you could go to, we hear a lot of talk these days about a smart grid system. Thank you.
I'm not getting anywhere near. I can't even bluff an answer to that.
Why are you looking at me? I think that these things can't be innovations where you find it. Kind of, I guess, is my answer to that. I don't know.
You mentioned a couple of things, one specific and one more of a general point. You asked specifically about the clean energy, clean tech bill, the Waxman bill, and the process, the specific political process. And then there was a broader question about if all this sort of goes in the direction of a carbon pricing, what implications would there be for automobiles and other clean energy? I'm skeptical about the Waxman bill. It's not a good bill. I don't think anyone who supports it publicly, when you talk to them in private, they all say this is a bad bill. But let's be honest about it. This is, the emperor has no clothes. But if you, and so, and I'm not, and there, we can get into a separate discussion offline about the really nerdy reasons why it's a bad bill. But if you ask the broader question, that America, after many years of not only neglect, but sort of malicious actions on this front, is beginning to take the issue of climate change, climate science, climate policy seriously. That we're likely in the next few years, which is relatively short for a planning horizon for investors, going to have meaningful federal policies on climate that will impose a meaningful carbon price across the economy. I think that is a very powerful, powerful change that's coming. And the Kyoto, Copenhagen process is a bit of a talking shop, but it's part of it. The way I look at that is, as with the the process of arms limitation talks between the Soviets and the U.S., or the GATT trade negotiation talks, that for year after year, decade after grinding decade, kind of rumbled along, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. They were useful in herding people in a general direction. But in fact, the realities were that the change happens on the ground, that the local policies upon which, whether it's at the state level and especially at the national level, and the innovations that come from the bottom up, those are going to be the real building blocks of that clean energy innovation you're talking about. So once the signal is clear that this is going to matter, whether your energy is clean or dirty, I think it will be a rising tide that lifts clean energy. I wouldn't make any specific bet for Detroit per se, and I would be very, very concerned if the government board that's now directing GM starts telling GM, you must build clean cars, because they'll almost certainly produce a clunker that nobody wants to buy. You don't want state-directed capitalism telling what products should be produced. Much better to have a price signal in the marketplace that makes these cars more attractive. And companies will come up with the versions of mobility that people actually want to pay for.
I should say, though, I'm much more skeptical than Vijay that we're going to get the price. I am an unabashed supporter of a stiff carbon tax or a real strong cap-and-trade system. But no country, and I include Europe in this, has actually enacted one. Europe has not cut its own emissions. It has bought offsets from China to the extent that it's managed at all. The people who've cut their emissions are people like Eastern Germany, who got credit for shutting down a bunch of inefficient, polluting industries that didn't make money, or Britain for converting to North Sea gas. No one sort of said, oh, I'm going to cut emissions and move towards that in a really strong way, the way we want to see them. The coordination problem is enormous, and the temptation is always to free ride, and especially with China and India, that is both an actual problem. China has already surpassed the United States as the largest actual block emitter, they're lower per capita, but the atmosphere actually doesn't care about social justice. It will warm up just the same. And so how you deal with, and it's a political problem because it's contentious not to force China and India to do it, but it's real contentious with China and India if we try to. So I am actually quite skeptical that we're going to get the kind of carbon price that I think we desperately need.
I think we have time for one more question, sir.
Hi, I'm Rich Limesider. I work for the Business and Society program of the Aspen Institute. I want to go back to the notion of, are we losing good jobs, these UAW jobs in Detroit? Because I'm concerned at the panel that we've sort of glossed over the social goal of egalitarianism or equality and spoken mostly about efficiency. And I think Ricardo and Schumpeter, are mostly talking about efficiency, but 50,000 UAW jobs, even if they move down south, isn't there a meaningful difference for the people who are working in the auto industry? If they're non-union jobs, if they're at much lower labor rates? I think we saw something similar in textiles and electronics in the Northeast over the past 50 years. Things first moved down south and then have largely moved to Asia, but a lot of those Northeast towns haven't recovered, the Rust Belt towns. Doesn't it matter?
I agree with you, and I agonize over this and do not have an answer. It's clear that, free trade, to take the obvious example, is good for the entire society as a whole, and it hurts individuals. My solution to all of this is the tax code. If I were dictator, I would have a very progressive income tax, and I would do it Megan's way, not tax the corporation, but tax the capital gains. But then I would say, go to it as a free market, and just recognize that the free market creates inequities that have no social justification.
But if I could jump in on that, a lot of the things, what Michael says is right, and I would even add, even though Megan's skeptical of this, I would give much more generous government resources for lifelong training, because I do think it is important. And as John Hennessy addressed from Stanford, we're living in a scientific age. Even at the bottom end of our value chain of employment, you have to have mathematical and scientific literacy. So I would put much more money into that. But a lot of things that people attribute to jobs being lost to free trade are actually due to technological change. And lots of studies have showed that. And it's really hard to argue against technological change, especially if she's investing in robots with her venture capital money. So I think that this is whatever one's notions of social equity. Stopping these winds of change, I think, is unlikely to succeed. Whereas addressing them the way that Michael points out, with much more sweeping policies, I think is actually what a country with a social conscience would do.
I think likely to succeed? You rolled up a couple of things into one. I mean, I should say that actually, I'm not against training in some sort of libertarian injustice. I look at the record, and the problem with the U.S. education system right now is not a lack of money. It's big structural problems that we have so far not found the political will to address. But you rolled up, geographic towns die. I mean, this is true 8,000 years ago. There are towns that, for whatever reason, and do people have the right to live in the town that they like to live in for the rest of their lives? Do they have the right to do the job? Well, if you look at the Luddite movement in England, they were right. Being a weaving cottager was way more fun than working in a cotton mill. And they were artisans, they had better jobs than they were going to get. It really did destroy their lives. Without that innovation, we would all still mostly be living on farms and spending probably 8 to 10 hours a day looking at the back of a mule. And I think that you have to say the social benefit. On egalitarianism, I'm not worried about the gap between rich and poor. If Bill Gates got 10 times richer today, I wouldn't care. What I care about is, do people have access to the building blocks of a good life? And I think, again, that obviously there is a big problem with that, but I think that those problems usually aren't even something that you remedy with the progressive income tax. They're things like crime and schools and really tough, thorny social problems that we're still working on. It isn't because people don't have good pay. It's because these basic building infrastructure that society is supposed to provide is crumbling, and we're getting worse and worse at providing it every year, and no one seems to have any idea what to do about it.
Well, it looks like we're getting invaded by the next panel. So let me just leave you with a couple quick thoughts. Is the loss of Detroit as an economic epicenter for America a substantial loss to the 21st century U.S. economy? I think a couple of our panelists would argue perhaps not. And in reality, it could be an opportunity for us to learn, from our failures and set a platform for innovation that will take us to a different place in the years to come. Is it a burden relieved? Again, some might argue, to some it may be, but to those who are losing their jobs, to those who don't have other alternatives, to those who need to be retrained, it's certainly not a burden relieved. It's a real worry. And is this largely a symbolic loss? I think time will tell. I think we'll only know when we're looking out 10, 15 years, and we'll see where we are. I'd like to thank our panelists, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. Thanks.